Hello, my name is Disha Walia and welcome to The Print. And in this week's column, I'll be talking about one of those, animals which we usually link to Africa and not to India. And I'm talking about the big flightless bird, which is the ostrich. And usually ostriches are linked to African continent, and it's quite, recently when I retweeted reposted on X about the discovery made by a group of archaeologists from different institutions, including from MSU Baroda, Dr. Anil Devra and his colleagues. They discovered world's oldest ostrich nest, and when I reposted that, a lot of people commented and said that it's impossible to find ostrich nests in India, and it's a fake news, it's a later thing, there is no conclusive evidence to it. So I thought that I should be talking about this because as archaeologists we are so used to listening and reading about ostrich eggshells and fragments of eggshells, and also the artifacts fashioned from these shell fragments, and usually we find these in Upper Paleolithic and prehistoric context, and we're so used to reading about them that listening to the public opinion was quite fascinating and interesting, and I thought let me just ponder over it in this week's column and talk more about the big flightless bird. So as I've mentioned that we usually link it to Africa, and it's quite it's people usually don't believe it when we say that they were part of Indian subcontinent, but today a lot of scientific data is coming out and it's been published in reputed journals which says otherwise. And in 2017 a group of scientists from BSIP, Lucknow, IIT and other institutions, they got together and they analyzed multiple samples of these fragments of ostrich eggs, and they undertook an ancient DNA studies on them from various prehistoric sites in India, and after the study was completed, they found out that the ostrich eggshell fragments that are found in Indian at various Indian sites are they matched by 92% with their African counterparts, which says that the ostriches which are in Africa are also, they share the same genome, same DNA with the fragments that are found at various prehistoric settlements in India. Now, to understand the earliest discovery of ostriches and how archaeologists and researchers have undertaken the study, we'll have to go back to 1930s and then later on 1980s, when actually the earliest fragments were started to come up and been reported at various sites right from 1880s, and then eventually there's a site called Patne in Maharashtra, which was excavated by S.A. Sali. And at this particular site, which is a primary context prehistoric site, a camping site, there they found a large number of ostrich egg shell fragments, and also they found a lot of beads. In fact, they found few beads and fragments which were in size, which were engraved. So they found a lot of these working which were also decorated in nature. Eventually at an important World Heritage site, a cave site, a prehistoric site in Madhya Pradesh, Bhimbetka, V.S. Wakankar has also found similar artifacts which linked the Upper Paleolithic period with these fragments, the eggshell beads, fragments, etc. And to be very honest, if you look at the world prehistoric scenario, finding of ostrich eggshell or shell beads are not an unusual thing from prehistoric context, especially from Upper Paleolithic context, at various sites, including in Europe and also in Africa. The early humans, have started to use these fragments, the pieces of ostrich egg shells, to make beads. And they have researchers have also undertaken a lot of ethno-archaeological studies in Kalahari and various areas in Africa where ostrich eggshells are still in eggs are still in use. So eggs are consumed and shells are then used to either storage of water or in various capacity. So ethnographical studies have also indicated that there is a multi-purpose use to ostrich eggs and subsequently the eggshell fragments. And interesting work recently was also done by Jennifer Miller and her colleagues, where the paper was published in Nature, and there she has studied about 15,000 of these beads, ostrich beads, and they have also traced and tried to understand what were the similarity between these beads, what are the morphological similarities and characteristics between different sites across Africa. And after the analysis, they have established that in fact about 50,000 years ago there existed a social network where the beads were being created in a very similar fashion. So there is not much difference between the beads found at one side which is far away from the other. So they have covered a large distance and found that about 50,000 years ago there was a social network, which again tells us that when early humans have started to make these artifacts, they have started to change the morphology and then modifying these fragments. They were using their cognitive sense and abilities, and then they were restoring this knowledge and then passing it on to the next generation, and also passing it on to their fellow kin, and also, which is fascinating, that knowledge were being transmitted in not only just in their neighborhood, but also in a large spatial region, which is quite fascinating how early humans have actually managed to establish such a fascinating social network in Africa. Now coming back to Indian subcontinent, the early studies, they after a lot of ostrich eggshell fragments were reported from various sites. In 1990s and 80s, there was a project which was launched, which was known as Prehistoric Man, the Ostrich Project. In this particular project, both ethnographical, experimental studies, and also documenting and reporting the work was undertaken. They created a map of various sites where these fragments have been found, and they found out that there were a lot of sites in India itself where ostrich eggshell fragments and the beads were being reported, and they are one of those earliest evidence of ornaments been found in the prehistoric context. And eventually they also undertook experimental studies, and they found that it's not that very easy to make beads out of ostrich eggshells, because they are thicker and it takes time and takes skill and precision and coordination to actually get that final product. So that work, the early work that was undertaken decades ago, was actually fascinating and laid the foundation. But today, with evolution of science and innovation and technology, we are now able to use various other means to help us understand this particular area and this research in a much better way. So when in 2017 the DNA study was undertaken, they have also tried to understand how the ostriches have landed in India, and how they ended up becoming part of Indian subcontinent. And what the paper actually suggests is that during the great continental drift, where from the African plate you have South America separating, and then you have Australia, Antarctica, and the continent was being divided, and there's a drift of including Madagascar and Indian plate, which makes up the present day India and Madagascar, Africa, and various other areas which got separated from Africa itself. A lot of fauna and flora also got separated and was also moved along with the land mass. So where Madagascar has elephant bird, it was ostriches with which, along with the plate during the continental drift, moved towards India, and that's how ostriches ended up being part of the Indian subcontinent. So one of the biggest questions that usually people ask is, how did this big bird ended up being part of the Indian subcontinent, where actually it is the native of African continent? And the answer to this question is, we have to move back to about 130 million years in antiquity, where this great continental drift was undertaken. And during around this part, Indo-Madagascar landmass was separated from African continent, and eventually, about 80 million years ago, Madagascar and the Indian plate also further drifted apart, and that actually separated ostriches from the African continent and Madagascar. Elephant birds ended up being part of Madagascar, whereas ostriches moved with the landmass which we today call our home, called India. And that's how, for 60 million years, ostriches made India their home. And about 20 million years ago, they started to migrate back from India via Arabia all the way back to Africa. So they migrated back. To be able to understand the biogeographical movement of ostriches to India, and to understand how these big flightless bird actually made India their home, we'll have to go back to about 130 million years in antiquity, where the great continental drift took place, and this was a time where Madagascar and India, the landmass which together forms up the present day Madagascar and India, separated from the African continent, and this was when the flora and fauna also got separated with these landmass, and it was the time when the elephant bird remained in Madagascar, the present day Madagascar, and then further on, when Indian plate moved away from Madagascar, the ostriches moved along with the Indian plate, and then for about 60 million years they made India their home, till 20 million years ago, where they started to migrate back to Africa via Arabia. So you do find traces of ostriches not only just in India and Africa, but also in Arabia, and also in China and Mongolia. So during this about 60 million years, where ostriches were part of Asia, they did spread to even in the east, and not just remained in one place. There is a migration that happened, but then that did not sustain, especially from India. The ostriches went extinct and they migrated back to Africa. And this also suggests to a lot of paleo environmental and climatic conditions which must have favored ostriches to sustain for 60 million years ago. But eventually the ecology would have been quite different. It also they must have been difficult for them to sustain, which pushed them to migrate back to Africa, which is quite a fascinating tale, and wish we have more data to understand this with more scientific analysis. But when the DNA study in 2017 was published, it really cemented that ostriches were actually part of they were living in India. They made India the native, the place to stay for about 60 million years ago. And then the recent finding of the nest also further cements this particular fact. It's actually it opens new doors to understand our prehistoric environment, a paleo environment in a better way, to understand the landscape and ecology in a better way. It clearly suggests that the landscape would have been very different from what it is today, and it would have even the human and animal relationship would have been very different, and by human I mean our ancestral species would have been very different. What the paper published in 2017 also points out, it says that the movement of ostriches back to Africa coincided with the movement of early hominids from Africa. So it coincided with the out of Africa migration as well. So it was sort of a it sort of coincided with the migration which happened from of ostriches from India to Africa, and of early hominids from Africa to India. And it just brings us back to the same question and the same thing, that we need more data, more clarity to understand the paleo environment and the landscape. But for now, it's quite fascinating to know that the bird we usually attach to African subcontinent were actually part of India at one point of time. With age, with science and technology, with more years of research, I'm sure we'll have much more interesting data of a lot of other animal species that are extinct in India. Perhaps we can understand our past in a better way. And this brings me to the same point I usually make in most of my columns, that our past is not linear, and our past is very fluid and complex, and our past is just not limited to us, the Homo sapiens. It precedes that, it goes beyond that boundary. And I hope we remember this, and I hope this will add more to our understanding of the past. For more such interesting videos and video columns and stories, follow The Print on their various social media platforms, and subscribe The Print on their YouTube channel. And until next time, thank you so much for watching.